Take a pit stop for all things NASCAR with the Four Tire Change podcast. Here is your host, Dawson Iserlo.
All right, we welcome you back into the Four Tire Change podcast here at ESPN Southwest Louisiana. Dawson Iserlo with you once again, and the playoffs are finally here. We have made it. It has been a long season, and it's time to go race for a championship. We are joined again here by our friend Chris Fusaro. Chris, appreciate it as always, and playoff racing, it's finally here.
Thanks again for having me on, Dawson. Arguably what we could call one of the better NASCAR regular seasons, at least you and I have seen in our lifetime. So happy to break it down and talk some playoffs.
All right, and we can't talk playoffs without first talking about the last race of the season because it once again had some drama here. Chase Briscoe, man. I mean, what a run for this last stretch. And, you know, it's interesting, of course, you know, we both listen to the guys over at the Teardown. And the question was asked, and both Jeff Gluck and Jordan Bianchi both specifically said, highly doubt that a new driver wins this last race. It just feels like a repeat winner type of situation. Darlington's been like that in the past, but it wasn't. Chase Briscoe, I mean, wins this race. And again, like the same thing with some of these other situations with the Austin Dillon thing before, you know, the incident. Not like he just got up there with a late restart or some fuel strategy. I mean, was up there all race and ran really well. And so it's one of those things, you know, obviously going into it, it feels like a fluke if Briscoe wins, but for the race itself, it really just wasn't. I mean, the 14 team was really fast and then they held off a charge at the end. So credit to them.
Yeah. And it felt like there were a lot of opportunities for them not to win that race too. Sort of like you said, it wasn't a fluke, but they very much earned it throughout the entire race, especially in the final stage. Multiple restarts where you fended off arguably the best car of the day other than himself and Kyle Busch, maybe Kyle Larson. I thought Kyle Busch that 8 team had a really, really fast car. So I don't know. It was going into the weekend, I thought Bubba Wallace was the only driver who was not currently in the playoffs that had a chance to win. They qualified well. They've run well at Darlington. But you look back at the last few Southern 500 winners, got guys like Eric Jones. You know, it is not a shoe-in for a repeat winner. So that's where I maybe disagree with the Teardown guys is Darlington has showed some wackiness, some weirdness. And it's a tough test. You heard drivers all weekend sort of leading in. It is arguably the toughest track in NASCAR to consistently drive 367 laps on or whatever they drove the other night. It's a tough facility. It's a well-earned win by Chase Briscoe. I really feel happy for him and the guys over at Stewart-Haas.
Yeah, and it's interesting too as you start to look at the teams and cars who did and didn't make the playoffs, right? And you know, it's a really tough break for Chris Buescher because it feels like he was pretty snake bitten this year. You know, we were talking during the race. I mean, you know, you go back to some of these close calls that he has taken away from him. And, you know, it really doesn't feel fair that the 17 team's not a part of these playoffs. And, you know, when you talk about finish, I think he was 11th in actual points or 12th. And so, you know, that's just, you had Harrison Burton win a race and just Chase Briscoe win a race and Daniel Suarez early and Austin Cindric. So all that stuff, it's tough luck for Bubba Wallace as well. You can kind of see the emotion and Ross Chastain. So, you know, those 3 guys plus Kyle Busch, especially at the end of the season, you got 4 cars that you feel like really, you know, could have maybe been playoff drivers, but they're not. And that's the format. And while I don't love every single aspect of it, I think in the end, promoting winning the way NASCAR does, I'm fine with. And I think, you know, for that reason, it's going to be entertaining, but it does, you know, lead you to believe like there was a chance if Kyle Busch got in the playoffs, if Bubba Wallace got in the playoffs, if Buescher was in, you'd feel like maybe they can make a run. You've got a handful of drivers here that, you know, feel like it's a courtesy appearance, have a little wave to the fans and move on after the round of 16. But hey, we've been wrong before. So we'll start getting into some of that stuff, but tough for those 4. I felt like those 4 were the ones, you know, that jumped out to me specifically. You can add anybody in, but those guys, you know, all felt like they had seasons that were maybe good enough to make the playoffs, but just not this season.
I would say definitely the 17 and the 23, Chris Buescher and Bubba Wallace. If it wasn't for potentially a crooked start-finish line at Kansas, Chris Buescher might be in the playoffs. The 23 car, they were consistent all year. It just didn't, I guess, show up when they really needed it to, per se. the weekends where they really had a fast car and felt like they could contend for a win, something went wrong. And then the other weekends where they didn't have as fast of a car, they were just sort of treading water, trying to get a top 15 out of it, which they did most of the time. But I feel like their really good cars were wasted. And if you're not a Hendrick Motorsports, not a Joe Gibbs Racing car, a team where you really have to grind and work your way into the NASCAR playoffs, you can't really afford your really, really good cars to be wasted. So I felt bummed for Bubba Wallace a bit. Sort of like I said, Chris Buescher, they were snake bitten. They had really good cars all year. His teammate and owner, Brad Keselowski, won a race this year. And I maybe would have thought that was flip-flopped that Chris Buescher won a race and Brad Keselowski either made it on points or was just left out.
And that's kind of where we are. So let's go through it here. We'll give the seedings first for those who don't know. Kyle Larson is the number 1 seed, despite the regular season champion being Tyler Reddick, because of all those playoff points that Larson has built up, thanks to the fact that he won 10 stages. And obviously, also worth noting, Kyle Larson definitely would have won the regular season championship if he didn't miss the Charlotte race. So that is going to come back to bite him a little bit. And I know that was a hot topic at the time, and it'll continue to be so until he does or doesn't run next year and continue to try and do the double there, but that ends up hurting him, unfortunately. But he's still the number 1 seed, and he's got 8 points clear of everyone else. So 40 points for Larson, 32 for Christopher Bell, who's the 2 seed. Reddick, despite being the regular season champ, only the 3 seed because he only had 3 stage wins and 2 overall race wins. William Byron, Ryan Blaney, Denny Hamlin. Of course, that big penalty looms large late in the season. He'd have been much higher, probably 2nd or 3rd. Without that, Chase Elliott is 7th, Brad Keselowski 8th, Logano 9th, Cindric 10th, Daniel Suarez 11th, which that's interesting. We'll go back to that. 10th and 11th seeds, despite, kind of feeling like maybe they wouldn't be here and if it wasn't for those wins. Bowman is the 12th seed, Briscoe 13, Harrison Burton 14, Ty Gibbs 15, Martin Truex Jr. is the last man in the playoffs. He and Gibbs tied with just 4 playoff points. So we made playoff predictions at the beginning of the season. When you go back and look at it here, you had, a handful out. There wasn't that many that were completely uncommon for us. I was wrong on Chastain. I was wrong on Austin Dillon, which ironically, I really could have got that one. It was a dart throw, and I almost had it. But obviously, NASCAR took it away. I was wrong on Kyle Busch, who I thought was going to get back into the playoffs this year. But a couple that I was right on, Keselowski was kind of one that wasn't a guarantee, and I got that one. So all in all, I end up with, I think, and then I was wrong on Bubba Wallace as well. So I think I was 12 for 16, although I could be miscounting. So not the worst, hey? Missed out on obviously Briscoe, Burton, Suarez, all the, and Cindric, I think. So all the surprise drivers. So, hey, it's not the worst in the world.
Yeah, I had Bubba Wallace and Chris Buescher in my playoff 16. I had Ross Chastain. I had Kyle Busch. And for some odd reason, I picked Eric Jones.
Hey, I remember the vibes. The vibes were high with the 43 team.
I guess I was just thinking of a Southern 500 win 2 years ago, and he was gonna be this weekend's Chase Briscoe. I don't know what the thought process was there, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah, and that's the tough thing about trying to predict too, and that's kind of what I said with Dillon. I felt like he was going to win a race. I definitely felt like Kyle Busch was going to win a race. Those two didn't work out, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. All right, so let's go back now and take a look at what we think of these playoffs. So the schedule is as follows: Atlanta, Watkins Glen, and Bristol for round number 1. So we know Atlanta's got a lot of variability to it. That's going to be interesting to see how that plays in as a playoff race. Watkins Glen and Bristol, you want to talk about 3 different racetracks here. Geez, we do not have that theme. In the past, you've had kind of those like, this is, there's a bunch of 1.5 miles in the second round or whatever it is. Round 1 this year is not like that at all. So I mentioned it earlier. It's interesting now that you break this down, and a guy like Austin Cindric, who stole a couple of stage wins as the year went on, or a guy like Daniel Suarez, who did get himself one as well, has at least a point or two. It's a point or two, so it might not help them. But which of the guys, and we'll go and say it this way, that won to get in, that did not get in on points, do you think has the best chance to make a run here past the round of 16?
Of the guys that you would expect in, or maybe stole a win throughout the year?
Yeah, so I'd say out of Cindric, Suarez, Briscoe, Burton would be those four that you really feel like are only there because they won a race.
I think it's got to be Austin Cindric. He is sort of like you said, he maybe stole a few stage wins, but they were pretty consistent. I think I don't know what the points breakdown would have been and where they would have been had they not won a race, but they would have been right there in the Busher Wallace, maybe not even back to the Kyle Busch area in points. So I would say Austin Cindric. I wouldn't count out Daniel Suarez. They've been better lately. They had a really rough sort of March, April, May after their win in Atlanta. So give me Austin Cindric, but I think there's a clear sort of five guys here in Cindric, Suarez, Alex Bowman, Chase Briscoe, and Harrison Burton that are maybe your five vying for one spot to move on.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Bowman, and I mean it's fair because he really, he did not have a great season, but he's in a Hendrick Motorsports car, so I guess we tend to, or I tend to give him the benefit of the doubt that he's going to have speed. But that's another thing, and this is why I actually, if I'm Daniel Suarez, if I'm Austin Sin, if I'm any of those guys we just talked about, Harrison Burton, I listen, the 21 team's going to have to really pull something off here to get past the first round, but if it sets up for him to do it, it's the way that this format is. Because you go to Atlanta, I mean, they could win again. They could definitely be top five. We know based on history that you're going to have a handful of playoff drivers that get into some trouble at Atlanta and finish in the 30s in this, in that race. So from that standpoint, then like we said, you're not going to leave Atlanta and then go to Kansas where you go, well, even if the 21 has a nice top 10 run, well, they're going to be terrible Kansas. You're going to a road course. And as we've seen, the road courses can be really unpredictable. And you finish it off at Bristol, another place where, look, there's chances are a handful of cars are going to get involved in somebody else's mess and be out of this thing anyway. So I think this year, more than any other year we've had this format, one of these Cinderellas could be dancing on into the second weekend, so to speak, if this was the NCAA tournament. Like, I think you really could have somebody. And yeah, you mentioned Cindric and Suarez. Think about Cindric. I mean, and Suarez for that matter. Both of them going to a road course in the second race out of this. And we've already seen, I mean, Suarez won in Atlanta earlier. So those cars could be in a spot where they're, 10, 15 points clear of the cut line heading into Bristol if all goes well. So I really am interested to see how it happens. And I will be just rooting for them just for the sake of the storylines of, but that's also why I would say if I'm a guy like, Ty Gibbs, Martin Truex Jr., even let's say Joey Logano, who only has 7 playoff points, I'm not feeling great about where these tracks are. I'd much rather be able to go to a Kansas, for lack of a better example, and, a Vegas where I go, okay, I'm going to have speed. I'm going to run top 15. Worst case, I'll be there. Those guys have to find a way to try and find a finish in Atlanta. And it also brings up the point, how aggressive are these playoff drivers going to be in Atlanta? Like, are we going to see some guys really lay back and just try and avoid getting caught up in something? But then the stage points become really valuable. I think it's going to make for really good racing.
I think it'll be one of those weeks, excuse me, sort of like the last 2 years, I would say. In Atlanta, you might get a winner that is not in the playoffs. I feel like we've seen that a lot over the past few years. Atlanta, it might happen. I feel like it's more likely to happen than Talladega, just from a pure strategy standpoint. If you can get to the front of the field, you can really take off at Atlanta. You can really hold your line. Whereas at Talladega, you can get shuffled back a little more. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it wouldn't shock me.
All right. Our championship fours, as we've talked about the playoffs here as a whole, let's start with you. William Byron, Tyler Reddick, Chase Elliott, Joey Logano in your championship four. All 4 of them are playoff drivers, so congratulations, you're still alive. Your champion's William Byron. I will give you the chance to change your picks here, or are you going to stick with what started there? I would imagine, the one who you'd feel least confident with is Logano at this point. But how do you feel about your original 4 here?
Okay. If you would have asked me in April if I thought William Byron would win the Cup Series championship, I'd say absolutely. Right now, I would say no. So
Right.
if I had to switch anything, it would be Joey Logano. But the second person behind that would be William Byron, actually. He does have obviously a very good standing in all of this as we go into the playoffs, but they've really been not great at all. over the last 3 or 4 months. I think Chase Elliott will be there, but I don't really see the 9 team as a threat compared to Reddick, Christopher Bell, and Kyle Larson. So I would say my championship 4 as of today would be Chase Elliott, Tyler Reddick, Christopher Bell, and Kyle Larson. I think Kyle Larson wins the championship.
So I had Christopher Bell, I had Chase Elliott, I had Denny Hamlin, I had Tyler Reddick. I feel pretty good about those 4, especially about Tyler Reddick, obviously, based on what he's done. We both didn't have Larson, and we talked about it at the time. That was, kind of just outside the box. I guess it wasn't going with the layup pick, but there was some doubts. Like Larson wasn't super, super dominant last year, but I actually feel the least confident about Chase Elliott of the 4, to be honest with you. I think even with what Denny Hamlin's overcome, I think he's going to put himself back in the mix. I still like his odds to get to the championship race. Although, again, it's just going to be such a wild card. Like that first round, that's why it's so valuable to have 40 playoff points the way Kyle Larson does, to be one of those guys like Reddick who's at the very top and Elliott who has a pretty good shot as well. So that way, you can have a throwaway result maybe at Atlanta and you finish 28th and you're still okay. It's going to be tough for, some of those, like Logano has no room for error. I mean, if they go to Atlanta and finish 30th, like they are up against it and they're almost going to be in win now territory, depending on what everyone else does. So I'll stick with my 4 and my champion's Hamlin. I'll stick with that as well. But yeah, I would definitely think Larson has a great shot to get in there. I think Tyler Reddick's been really, really solid. He's so consistent. But I still love the idea that Christopher Bell, when his back's against the wall, it feels like he wins every time he needs to win. So let's see if he wins, if he has to win at some point in these playoffs. Well, anything else for you that's going to be a fun storyline you think to follow throughout these Cup Series playoffs?
Hold on in Atlanta and Talladega, boys. It's going to get wild.
There you go. I agree. All right, Chris, I appreciate your time as always. It'll be a lot of fun. This week at Atlanta, we kind of covered it already. I guess we can make a pick for it. It's going to be a toss up. I kind of like you though. I'll go Kyle Busch, like somebody outside the playoffs spoiling it. Kyle keeps the streak going. They've been really fast recently. Who you got?
Bubba Wallace.
There we go. Another one. So we're saying just completely throw it away, off the wall, out of the playoffs, spoil somebody's day. And there you have it. Another edition of the 4-Tire Change playoff preview this time with our guy, Chris Fusaro. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Continue to like, comment, subscribe if you're not already, and join the movement. Let's go ahead and get ready for the NASCAR Cup Series playoffs. It'll be fun. We'll see you.